Anything else? All right, we're in the old book, page 2.
Dad have to? Oh. Her dad's getting ready to move to rehab. Cynthia's father's about to get moved to rehab.
Okay, that's it. Move to rehab, send it there. Anyone else? Okay. Oh, wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. Oh, wonderful Savior to me. He hides my soul in the flare of the rock, where rivers of pleasure I see. He hides my soul in the flare of the rock, and shadows of thy thirsty land. He hides my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. The wonderful Savior is Jesus, my Lord. He takes my burden away. He holds me up and I shall not be moved. He gives me strength as I can. He hides my soul in the breath of the rock that shadows of my thirsty land. He hides my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. When clothed in his brightness, transported I rise to meet him in the clouds of the sky. His perfect salvation, his wonderful love, I will shout with the millions on high. He hides my soul in the cleft of the rock that shadows a dry, thirsty land. He hides my life in the depths of his love, and covers me there with his hand, and covers me there with his hand. Mark your books to 702 of their songs that day. 702. And then if you would turn back to 25. After a song, we'd ask Eddie if he would have her open in prayer and then turn it over to Rob. 25. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him there is joy would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, here I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I am not alone. Other friends may fail me, he is still my own. Though his hand may lead me over various ways, anywhere with Jesus is a house of praise. Anywhere, here I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the darkening shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall wake and nevermore to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, here I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. What a great.
Mighty Holy Father, as we assemble here this evening, we give you the honor and praise, Father. We just thank you so much for the beauty of the day, the warmth that has came up this afternoon. We just thank you for all that you do for us. You have blessed us far and above beyond measure, Father. We just thank you so much. Most importantly, Lord Father, the greatest blessing of all is the love that you have for us, that you allowed your Son to die, that we may have a path back to you. We just pray that as we enter this hour, that you would give us understanding and wisdom, that we may comprehend and learn more about you and your word, and that we may share with others. As we're reminded to hear the singing, though, Father, we have good health that allows us to be here. They've been several mentioned, and you know their names, and you know the ones in our midst, Father, that need your healing hand. We just pray that you attend to their needs as only you can, Father. In all things, as we go to our class, just bless us with understanding. In Christ's name we do pray. Amen.
Good evening, church. Good evening. She didn't want to miss the good evening. We made sure she did. I got to get my third microphone on. How many we got going on? 3 over there, 2 over there. There we go. All right. Okay. Everybody up for a long night? Everybody's looking at it. What? Just kidding. All right. So we're going. All right. We got up to, I believe it was the book of Joshua last week in our quick surveys of the books. We're going to be touching on a few things with Joshua and some interesting information. I'm one of those people who are very big geeks about history, as I'm sure you already know. So I'm going to show you some history geekdom here in a minute. The genre of the book of Joshua is narrative history. This is not allegory. It is not poetry. It is meant to be taken literally. So when you read the book of Joshua, as many people do, they try to compare it with what is the common chronologies, and they run into problems with what the world says the years should look like and what the Bible says the years should look like. And many of them will err on the side of the world instead of the scripture. But I'm going to show you here in a minute why we should always err on the side of the scripture. The key personalities in this book, the major ones, are Joshua, of course, himself, a woman named Rahab, who will become instrumental in the success of one of the missions and one of the takeovers of one of the cities. Achan, who shows what happens with sin. Phinehas and Eleazar, who have a few little problems themselves, but we'll get into those as we get there. The book was mostly written to assure the Israelites the living God will reward obedience, and also to record the entrance and conquest of the promised land. Problems that they had in the book of Joshua was they did not conquer everyone as they were supposed to. So there were issues that were seen all through history just because of this. And then we'll probably touch on a few of those problems tonight. Joshua demonstrates his faith in God as he follows the orders given him and takes leadership of the nation. And we get that famous verse in Joshua 1:7, where it says, "Above all, be strong and very courageous to carefully observe the whole instructions my servant Moses commanded you. Do not turn from the right or to the left, that you may have success wherever you go." And we know that when we looked at that last week, as we ended up our old study and started getting into this book, one of the things that you should note is that when it says be strong and courageous, it is not talking about courage in battle. It is not a warning for anyone to just simply be strong and courageous in general. It is telling Joshua, be strong and courageous to observe what God has commanded you through Moses. And in today's world, we mentioned, I think at the end last week, that it is very difficult for us to be strong and courageous and follow the will of the Lord in a corrupt world. So that was the first thing he was told. And the reason he was told that is because previous to this, we got 40 years of wandering. They're running into very few other civilizations in that wandering. The ones they do are mostly warlike, or it's Moab, and Moab tells them to go around instead of coming through. And when they get to the promised land, they're going to be seeing all kinds of false gods again, just like when they were in Egypt and they were surrounded by false gods. So they had to have strength and courage to be in a land like that. When I was going off to college, I was blessed to be able to go off to a college that was run by the church. And that gave me a little bit of protection in college. I have friends that went to different ones, and they should have been more strong and courageous. Yes, sir.
The Moabites were actually relatives.
Yeah, that's the weirdest thing. They are their relatives, and they said, "Go around, idiot. We don't want you here." They were afraid. Okay, where are we at now? The outline of Joshua begins in chapter 1 and going on to chapter 4. This is Joshua and the Israelites enter the promised land, and in doing so, we read of an amazing entry. It's interesting how they started their journey in the wilderness when they crossed the Red Sea by miraculous intervention, and it said the wall was the water was a wall to them on the right and to the left, so they could walk through on dry land, not muddy land, not swampy land. I don't know, every time I see it in movies or anything, there's always mud puddles, when they're running around them, splashing in them, and they run through. It's not what the Bible said. Why can't we just show what the Bible said, right? But as they arrive at the River Jordan, we find a detail of incredible, miraculous crossing. As we know, they walk up, and the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant out into the Jordan River, and when it gets up to their knees, the Jordan River breaks, and they can go through. God shows an incredible grace to a prostitute named Rahab, the ancestress of King David. That's right. Rahab is in the line of David, which means Rahab is in the line of Jesus because he is a direct descendant. And we see that here. It is an interesting show of incredible grace. I think the last time we talked about Joshua's conquest of Jericho, I showed you the picture of the one remaining room in the wall that is standing from that time period. So the entire wall fell except for one small section, and in that section was a window, and behind that window was a house. And I showed you, there was a video I had, and if I had thought about it, I would have brought it up to show you again. But in that video, what's his name? Yeah, I'm getting terrible at this now in my old age, right? Dr. Patton. I want to keep calling him Dr. Connor. I don't know why. Dr. Patton said, "I think I know who lived there." And the Bible says that the walls fell, but Rahab lived on the wall. And it makes perfect sense that all the rest of the walls would have fallen except for hers. These are my giddy moments. All right, so there are two discoveries since the late 70s and into the 90s that I thought were just amazing. On Mount Ebal, there's a couple of great things. And I want to read you from the Bible here in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 29. It says that when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal. And we read that a lot. We read about how one group stood on Gerizim and one group stood on Mount Ebal, and they shouted blessings across the valley. Shechem is in the middle where that city is, the city of Abraham. And then over here on Ebal, they're shouting curses back. Now, anyone who goes there, if you can get permission to go to the two mountains right now, it's very difficult. But you can stand from one mountain to the other and talk just about like I am, just a little bit of projection. And on the other mountain across the valley, you can hear a person talk. So it's very much okay to say they stood on one mountain and give blessings, and on the other mountain they gave curses. But what we find on Mount Ebal is even more interesting. So we find this. There's a folded lead tablet that they found. It was very difficult for them to open and read, and it took very many years. And it's not very big. I mean, we're talking probably a little larger than a silver dollar. And on it was written this: "You are cursed by the God Yahweh, cursed. You will die, cursed. Cursed you will surely die. Cursed you are by Yahweh, cursed." Where did they put the curses? They put them on Mount Ebal. And after they said the curses, they left these little lead tablets up there of the curses to remind them of what that would happen if they did not follow the law of God. Now we see it in the dirt. We see this. So then somebody says, well, that didn't happen. Well, that says it did. And it's from the right time period. So I would say that it actually happened. So we have a curse placed where the Bible expressly said it would be placed. So when someone says Joshua didn't enter the land of Jericho as it said, I can say, yes, he did, and here's proof. But if you need more proof, let's read a little bit here in Joshua chapter 8, beginning in verse 30. It says, at that time, Joshua built an altar to the Lord, the God of Israel, on Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the people of Israel, as it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of uncut stones upon which no man has wielded an iron tool. And they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. And there, in the presence of the people of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses, which he had written. And all Israel, sojourner as well as native born, with their elders and officials and their judges, stood on opposite sides of the ark before the Levitical priest who had carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, half of them in front of Mount Gerizim, half of them in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded at the first to bless the people of Israel. And afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessing and the curse, according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses commanded that Joshua did not read before all the assembly of Israel, and the women and the little ones and the sojourners who lived among them. Some of the note numbers get put in there and changes the word to hand instead of and. Now, why is all of that important? 1980, Professor Zertal discovered a large rectangular altar on Mount Ebal, about 30 square meters and 3 meters high. And we'll show you that picture here in a minute. Trust me, it's got me with bated breath sometimes to watch these things. From 1982 to 1989, he excavated that altar that he found, and he believes the large rectangular structure was Joshua's covenant ceremony altar that we just read about. Now, what did it look like? It looked like that. Exactly in the place that the Bible said it should be, made of, as you can even look and see, uncut stones. And you see people there for scale, right on the side of the mountain. And they said Joshua never entered. Joshua never built an altar on the side of the mountain. They said that's got to be a Canaanite altar. It can't be Joshua's altar. Well, there's a problem with that. The excavations around the large structure revealed mounts of ash and over 1,000 bones from young choice male animals, and they called them kosher animals. They were male bulls, male goats, and male sheep. Tell me how perfect that is to the way the Bible said sacrifice should be made, the altar should be built, where the altar should be, and the massive amount of sacrifice that was done. If you read in the book of Numbers, when it starts cataloging all of the different sacrifices that they did, it's all perfect. And it indicated the site was used for animal sacrifices conducted according to biblical standard. In fact, if you'll notice, there are ramps leading up to that altar. And as the Bible expressly said, you will not put steps leading up to my altar that you uncover your nakedness. You only can ramp up to the altar. So all of that is perfectly in the design that God did. Based on the pottery and scarabs found, Zertal dated the altar from the 13th to the 12th centuries. In fact, a scarab of Thutmose III was found next to the altar. And that was the most likely pharaoh of the Exodus. So that's what they did in Egypt. They carried those scarabs for good luck. And you think about 40 years, somebody hid one and they dropped it. Or maybe they finally gave it up. So that's just some interesting historical stuff that I was reading about, and I thought I'd share with you. So when you read this, you kind of got a picture. This is what the altar looked like. Around that, there is an encampment in the shape of a shoe that is near there. And that encampment, which has the altar as part of it, in that shape makes sense because God told Israelites, everywhere the sole of your foot strikes will be your land. And when they built their encampment on the side, it was in the shape of a foot. Just think, if they may have done that on purpose or by accident, but I like to think it was on purpose. I was claiming it. Chapters 5 through 12, Joshua follows God's orders and first conquers the central of the promised land. This includes the unlikely manner in which they conquered the grand fortress of Jericho. How many of us remember how that happened?
The old song tells Joshua at the Battle of Jericho.
And the walls came tumbling down. That's right. They marched around it for 7 days. And on the seventh day, they marched around it again and again and again and again. Then they blew the horns and everyone screamed. You got to admit, if you were in that city as a guard looking over that wall and you see them just marching around the city every day, you're like, what are you doing? Looking for a hole? There's no hole. We're good. And then everything just falls. And it says the walls fell down and they ran up and inside. And if you look at the dig site there, the wall that fell is still there. And the way it's piled up, it looks like a ramp leading up into the city. So it's easy to see how everyone could have just run straight up and inside.
Kind of the same way as people today. They look at people who are trying to follow God's word
Mhm.
and the way it says, and they think they're foolish.
Yeah.
They thought they were foolish following God's word.
Yeah, there's a few people, the people in Jericho who thought they were foolish by walking around it, everyone outside the ark until it started raining. There's a lot of people out there. The people on Babel, when they were building a tower so they can get to God their own way, until none of them could talk to each other because they were speaking the wrong language. Those things are most of that in the rocks today, too. Now, A was the next town, although it took 2 tries. The first, due to sin in the camp, on the second attempt, God again moved and they dominated. Interesting things about A, which I always called AI until one of my professors corrected me. I don't care which one you use. I'm not that hurt over it. If you want to say AI or A, just like in the word ace or is, which is EIS, however you want to pronounce it in Greek, I'm fine with. But we were talking about this is unique because Achan steals stuff from Jericho and hides it in his tent. And when they go up to fight A, God is not with them and they lose. And they want to know why they lost. And the reason they lost is because of one man's sin. And some people say, well, that's not fair because that was only one person that sinned, not the whole camp. Who is in charge of the camp? The leaders of the camp. And if the leaders could not convince their own people to not go against what God asked them to do, then the entire encampment now is under bad leadership, and God's not going to support that. Why do small churches sometimes fail, even if they have all of their leadership in place? Because they have bad leadership in place. And as I think it was Don Blackwell who said, no leadership is better than bad leadership in a church. So you got to understand that going into it too. So if they had poor leadership and someone was stealing when they weren't supposed to take any plunder, then they had to be taught that lesson that they need to listen to God and make sure everyone's doing what was supposed to be done. But the more interesting thing is, after Achan is destroyed because of his sin, God says, you guys can plunder this city. So if he had just waited and done to Jericho what God had said to do and destroy everything, then God would have been with them and said, you can now plunder this city and take things with you. And he would have gotten what he wanted. But he didn't want to wait on God's time, which is another thing I think a lot of people fail at today. We like our time better than God's time. And then what happens? We fail. So we got to make sure that we watch ourselves. After this, the Israelites occupied the southern land and then the northern land to complete the occupancy. However, although they controlled the region, they did not completely conquer it. That's where their problems came. The Jebusites, the Hivites, I don't know, all the ites that are in that area, the Hittites, and the Philistines, and all of them, there were pockets of those cultures still available. The Jebusites still controlled Jerusalem up until the time that David was king. So they were still making conquest of the area they should have had when David was king. Saul was fighting everybody. David was fighting everybody. It was a mess because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. In chapters 13 through 24, the land is divided up and distributed among the tribes of Israel. So you get to see where everyone's inheritance would have been. Some of the larger cities are placed aside for the Levitical priests who did not receive a portion of land due to their duties. The Levitical priests got no inheritance because they were to live off the service of the Lord completely. The cities of refuge were basically given to the Levites, and they didn't really get much in that inheritance. But the thing is, you brought in tithes of everything, 10% of all your goods, and the Levites took a portion of those goods and put them in the storehouse, and the rest of the goods were for the Levites. That was their inheritance, if you want to give it anything. So they literally lived off the service of God in that time.
Very interesting story how the Levites became the Levitical priests.
Mhm.
And they were bought by God, actually,
Yeah.
in exchange for the firstborn.
Yes. And they were the ones that finally stood with Moses when the evil of the golden calf was done. And so they got that extra. Now, it says, lastly, Joshua dies. But before he passes, he gives one of the greatest challenges that lasts for all generations, including our own. Choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. That is a very poignant statement for the generations. If you go to chapter 24, before we get into the book of Judges, and you look at verse 15, the way that I'll even back up to verse 14. This is in the covenant renewal period. Therefore, fear the Lord and worship him in sincerity and in truth. Get rid of the gods your fathers worship beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and worship Yahweh. Now, so the first thing we see, we're talking about those things found in the dirt near that altar were scarabs, and those were ritual charms in Egypt. A lot of times they had blessings and curses and things of that nature that people would carry with them. And it was almost like a household idol to carry with you. So they had to get rid of those. And it says, but if it does not please you to worship Yahweh, choose for yourselves today the one who you will worship. The gods of your fathers worship beyond the Euphrates River, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. As for me and my family, we will worship Yahweh. We're going to serve God. And that's the way that most of us have to approach talking about the Lord even today, because we need to know if a person is going to worship God or worship something else. And the reason it says choose today whom you will serve is because we need to know who's with us and who's against us moving forward. There's going to be a change of leadership. Joshua is getting old. In fact, in verse 29, it says, after these things, the Lord's servant Joshua, son of Nun, died at the age of 110. He hung on there just to lead that, didn't he? Imagine 100-year-old Joshua marching around Jericho. And he didn't even need a wheelchair. God was with him.
Was the family of Abraham, weren't they sun worshipers?
I think that's what that would have been. If you go to the city of Ur, you can see. Yeah. Yeah. Abraham's family in Ur, there's a lot of that there. And in Haran, where they went with his father before he died, Haran has got those temples in it everywhere. So it's very likely that his father was not a follower of God. And they went there on his behalf and then left him there because God was like, that's not where I told you to go. Let's go. Come on. And they had to go somewhere else. Judges. I love the Judges. There are some judges in here that have one verse. By the way, here's a judge and he killed 400 people. That's it. That's all you get. That's right. The book of Judges includes several interesting genres. It's got poetry. It contains riddles, but it's mainly narrative. So the book of Joshua and the book of Judges is meant to be taken as history. We're not supposed to say, oh, here's a bunch of myths about people who got risen up at some point in time. The author is anonymous, but usually assume that Samuel, the prophet, wrote it. And that makes sense because Samuel was the final judge of Israel. Because after that, we went into the kings of Israel. And it would make sense if he did. We're not sure. We're not going to stake our lives on the fact that Samuel wrote the book, but it would make sense. It begins with, after the death of Joshua, the Israelites inquired of the Lord, who will be the first to fight for us against the Canaanites? And the Lord answered, Judah is to go. I have handed the land over to him. And then it goes through successive battles going into it until we get to a point where it says, and then a generation rose up who did not know. That's where things get bad. Key personalities are Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Jephthah, Samson, and, of course, wonderful Delilah. Why do we still name our daughters Delilah? She does not have a good heritage. That's all I'm going to say. The purpose was to teach Israel that God is faithful and certain to punish sin. Therefore, each person must remain loyal and devoted to God. That's what we should learn. I don't think we learned that a lot. The book shows the immediate generations after the conquest of the Promised Land, and unfortunately, the results of unfaithfulness are similar to what we have seen in the past. That's the same thing that happened before they went in wandering. They follow after false gods. They forget about the Lord. They try to do things themselves. We see a pattern of faithfulness, and then things get good, and then unfaithfulness, and then things get bad, and they're occupied, and then God raises up a judge to rescue them. Then they come out of that, and things get good again, and then always up and down, up and down. Chapter 3, verse 7 on Othniel says, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, for they forgot the Lord their God and worshipped the Baals and Asherahs. And the Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he sold them to Cushan Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, and the Israelites served him 8 years. So they got sold out by God because they were being what God would consider adulterers to him for committing idolatry. My neck's been stiff all day. I'm sorry. Playing with it up here. Chapters 1 through 3:6, we find that the Israelites have failed to keep their part of the covenant. What were they supposed to do? They're supposed to destroy utterly the people in those lands, and they didn't do it, even though that's what they're supposed to do. They did not entirely conquer, take control of all the land that they were promised. They got lazy with it. And the problem, unfortunately, grows wildly out of control as time goes on. There was a time in history where the Muslim nation had been reduced to a group in one city. And that city was surrounded by military. And it was a Catholic military that surrounded that city. And they had control nowhere else in the world at this point. And the military of the leader said, why should we wipe them out utterly? They're of no consequence. And left. And what did they do? They rebuilt, they grew, and they took back over all that territory. That's why God said in this day, when it came to the land of Canaan, get rid of everyone. Because if you leave anybody, this is what will happen. And that's exactly what happened. From verse 7 in chapter 3 to verse 16, God raises up judges to rescue Israel several times. We see that cycle of sin, rescue, worship, sin. That's the whole thing. And it continues consistently. So they sin, they're punished, they get rescued, they worship God, then they sin. And then they get punished, and then they get rescued. These rescues were temporary because we find that the nation's obedience only lasted as long as the life of that particular judge. Every single time. Here's the one I saw at Shamgar. So after Ehud, this is verse 31 of chapter 3. After Ehud, Shamgar, son of Anath, became judge, and he delivered Israel by striking down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. That's his whole life, by the way. That's his entire life story. You know, I would love to have one verse in the Bible be my whole life story. That's fine with me. But he's got that. Out of the 14 judges mentioned, the major judges standing out are the famous stories of Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. Those are the three I think we all know. Chapter 17 through 31, we see Israel slumping into a horrid state of moral demise and ruin. Predominantly the tribes of Dan and Benjamin, we see how far man has really turned from God of Abraham. They're terrible. Dan and Benjamin are absolutely the worst of the tribes. I mean, when you read it, it is some of the most disturbing stories to read yourself. And what is fascinating about those stories is that God did not sanitize them. He did not hide them away in history. He said, this is exactly how it happened. And you get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly in Judges. The tribe of Dan had almost completely given into the worship of idols made by a man named Micah, even to the point that they practically defend it. Remember that wonderful thing where he goes to a person's house and becomes the priest of the household gods, and then he gets kidnapped by Danites, and they take him to his city so he can be the priest of those gods for him. You know, it's ridiculousness. Yes, sir.
It says 17 to 31.
Yeah. I must have misprinted that one. That's what happens when your finger hits the button. All right, through 21. There we go. I'll get that changed in the slide for next time. Appreciate it. You're almost as bad as Henry. I'm just kidding. He catches my spelling mistakes.
Well, he was sleeping over there, so
After Dan's sin, Benjamin is wiped out down to 600 men in a violent and vicious civil war. And here we read that sad passage of truth. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit, or as he pleased. That's an awful place in the Judges. Before we get into Ruth, I want to touch on a couple of the big names in here. Deborah is used a lot as an excuse to talk about women in modern leadership, and yet it is very clear that Deborah is raised up as a punishment, not as a blessing. And it even says in everything that goes through there that the men will not get credit for their victories. And that was to prove a point and to teach them a lesson. Doesn't give her any less authority or any less good things that happened to her, but her reasoning behind it were different than what a lot of people try to say. When it comes to Gideon was a coward for the most of his life. He ended up going, and we know he had a great multitude of men that was reduced down to a small multitude of men, which was reduced down to 300, and he surrounded the Midianites, and they fought the Midianites in the first battle with jars and trumpets and torches, and they killed each other. And then after that, he got all of his men back together and went to town killing everybody. He tried to get his son to kill the kings. His son was too scared. He did it himself. Realized how much of a person and evil that he had made himself out to be by what he was doing. They offered to make him king of Israel. He said no. And do you know what he did after that? He went back to being a farmer. He said, I'm done. And he went back to that. That's what's so interesting about him to me. He didn't trust that God was God at the beginning. You remember the fleece? So let's start out this way. I'm going to put a fleece out. You make the fleece wet and everything else dry, and I'll believe you're God. Okay. You know what? Let's try this again. Let's make everything wet and the fleece dry. That seems harder. Okay, I believe you. It was just that he had a little trust issue. And I understand his trust issue because even Satan can appear as an angel of light, right? He just wanted to make sure it was the God of all creation and not some demon or just some guy that showed up and tried to trick him. When it comes to Samson, Samson's downfall starts near the beginning of Samson's account. Because first, he marries non-Israelites.
After Gideon was given the 2 proofs, didn't God give him a third one?
Yeah.
That was an interesting way God gave him that.
We can go to that one here and read it if we want to. Again, back to it. All right. Oh yeah, you're talking about when the angel of the Lord extended the tip of his staff and was in hand and touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire came from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. Yeah, that kind of gives you the power of God and His might, doesn't it? All right.
God always blesses the abundance.
Yes, He does. Samson was born to be a Nazarite. We talked about the difference between a Nazarene and a Nazarite. Nazarene just happened to grow up in Nazareth. A Nazarite was someone who took a vow. The difference with Samson is that he was made a Nazarite from birth. She was not allowed to drink wine or beer or eat anything unclean. While she conceived and bore the son, he was not allowed to drink wine or beer or to eat anything unclean, nor was he allowed to cut the hairs of his head his entire life, because he was not a Nazarite vow for a time. Like if you said, I need to go to war and I'm going to take a Nazarite vow that I will not return home until after the war is completed, then you would make a sacrifice, you would shave your head, and then you would go out, you would not cut your hair, nor do any of these other things until after that vow was completed. And when it was, you would go back to the priest and you would show yourself to the priest and prove that your vow was complete, at which time you would wash yourselves ritually and shave your head completely, and that would end the vow. So Samson his vow was not to end his entire life. That's why when she shaved his head, everything ended, because that was the end of a Nazarite vow. And he had to pray to God that he got his strength back and he was allowed to get his revenge.
Could it be that it was more than just a shaving of the head with the disobedience of telling her?
There was a lot of things. Yeah. But his first thing that he really did wrong, if I could find it real quick without taking up too much time. All right. In chapter 14, right before Samson's riddle, it's in verse 5. It begins with, Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Suddenly a young lion came roaring at him, and the Spirit of the Lord took control of him, and he tore the lion apart with his bare hands, as he might have torn a young goat. But he did not tell his father or mother what he had done. And then he went and spoke to the woman, because Samson wanted her. And after some time, when he returned to get her, he left the road to see the lion's carcass. And there was a swarm of bees with honey in the carcass. And he scooped some honey into his hand and ate it as he went along. What has he done? He has eaten honey that is in the carcass of an unclean animal. So therefore, he has eaten something that is unclean. There's where his downfall starts. Everything from this moment literally goes downhill with him. He gets his wife. His wife is taken back by her father. He is not returned to her. He kills them. He is wanted. He kills more people. He gets to Delilah. She takes his hair after he tells her why he has the strength that he has. He is blinded and put into service in the granaries, and then he is chained up in the temple of, I think it's Dargo or Dagron, or I can't remember the name of the Philistine god there. And they're having their feast and they're making fun of him. And he prays that he can have that one final act of strength. And he reaches his hands out and, he pushes over the pillars and the whole temple comes collapsing down. And I heard some people say, well, nobody ever built temples with just 2 pillars. The whole thing would fall down. And then they go and dig in Philistia. And lo and behold, half the temples have 2 central pillars that are about 5 feet apart that hold up the entire roof. So, yes, they did have those temples just like that. What we learned most, I think, from Samson and his life that we can take an account of is that it doesn't matter how much we feel blessed by God where we are, we cannot take that blessing for granted. He was blessed from birth. He had everything basically handed to him. He grew up knowing he would be a judge. He knew he would have something special with God. When he finally was elevated to that position, I think he let it go to his head that he was that special since he was born, and nothing he could do was wrong, and God would always take care of him. And as we see, he kept compounding sin after sin after sin after sin until he was in the depths of all of that sin in the worst part of his life, and he had to go to God in humility and pray and ask for forgiveness so that he could come out of that pit. A lot of times that's where we find ourselves. We start getting into a pattern of sin, whatever that sin may be. It could be something very minor. You could have I guess the easiest one that most people fall into is the pattern of lying. A pattern of lying starts when you lie about one very simple, solid thing. You're out fishing and you catch a fish that is 6 inches and you say it's 15. Okay? Simple, easy lie that a lot of people do, which is still wrong, but you did it. And then more people ask about that fish, and what do? It gets bigger each time. Okay? So you get into this cycle until finally, at some point, you have to get out of it because you're like, look, it was too small. I had to throw it back. It wasn't as big as it was. The only real world example I have of that compounded lie over years, I was sitting after my stepfather's funeral over at my mother's house, and we and my brothers were all there. We're all talking to mom and just having a good time. And then our stepbrother is there with his wife, and we're talking with him, and she goes, there's a lot of interesting things that happened with my sons over the years. And we're all wondering what she's going to say. And she says, Hoss, which is Richard's name. I'm not supposed to call him Richard, but I do anyway. Says, he was at Kings Island one year, and Richard stops her right there and says, Mom, don't tell that story. It was a lie. She says, what? And he says, I know what you're going to tell, and I'll tell you what the lie was. He says, I know what you're going to tell, and I lied about it. I was 14, and I wanted to look cool. Richard is 53 this year. Since he was 14, he held that lie back because he didn't even confront it, never took care of it. And what he said was, while he was on this little pirate ship that rocks back and forth, that 2 seats behind him was the band The Beach Boys, because they were singing that night at Kings Island. Since they were riding the ride with him, he thought it was so awesome, and he got to shake all their hands and meet him. And that lie carried with him for years because he never confronted it. And then finally, that moment, he had to just squelch it. I don't think he perpetuated it, mind you, for those years, but because he never took care of it, that sin just stayed there somewhere in someone's head. And that can happen. And it could be something less than that simple as a little funny lie you tell when you're 14 to make yourself look better. You could get into what David did, where he started by seeing a woman across taking a bath, and then he had adultery with her, and then he killed her husband, and he married her, and he had the child, and it just lying to adultery to murder. Okay, that pattern, they say, doesn't happen often. It happens. You watch the first 48 and tell me how many times a person lied, committed adultery, and then killed somebody on that show. 100 times, I think I've counted so far, because sin compounds itself. You can't get out of it on your own. How do you get out of sin? Only through Jesus Christ. In the day of the judges, he raised up a judge to help them out. In the days that we have now, he raised up his own son on a cross to die so that we could have our sins removed. We don't have to stay in this state of sin or perpetuating it anymore. So if there's a sin in your life that you're struggling with, you need to get rid of, pray that God forgives you. And if you need to go to someone and tell them about that sin to get it taken care of, tell them, get it done. That's the easiest thing to do. And even if there are earthly consequences, that's fine, because heavenly consequences would be worse. If you're not a Christian, of course, and you need all of your sins removed, there's only one way: through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, which we have through our baptism into Christ. So if you need prayers for sin in your life, or for restoration in the faith, or you need to be baptized into Christ, whatever you need, let's get it done right now as we stand and sing our song together.